Hello everyone. I am Khandakar Kohinur Akter and I'm doing my master's thesis on this topic. So firstly, I would like to tell that I'm just in the initial stage of my thesis. So I'm just trying to put 2 or 3 major points to intervene in the legal system of Bangladesh through the paper that I'm going to present here. So the title is the legal interventions and access to maternity health services by women with disabilities in Bangladesh, lessons from Canada. So first of all, defining the reproductive rights, that we know that reproductive rights are among the basic rights promised to the people with disabilities, including the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to marry and found a family, the right to comprehensive reproductive health care, including family planning and maternal health services, education and information, the right to give informed consent to all medical procedures, and the right to be free from sexual abuse and exploitation. So the background of this study is that in Bangladesh, women with disabilities are deprived of rights and privileges because of the existing social stigma towards them. Being disabled and at the same time being women make the situation as double trouble. Like any other human rights, the maternal health care rights of Bangladesh of women with disabilities have been ignored and violated on a larger scale. It has been wrongly portrayed in Bangladesh that women with disabilities are not even capable of forming a family and parenting, which is quite a negative stereotype. On the other hand, a comprehensive legal framework can be discerned from Canadian healthcare laws and disability-related laws. So this study will aim to explore the barriers of various kinds that women with disabilities in Bangladesh face during the maternity examining, how they are treated in their families and by the medical service providers. Additionally, the focus of the study will be on how the existing legal framework is addressing these issues and where the further attention is needed. In Bangladesh, actually, there are legislations titled as the Protection of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2013, along with the Protection of Rights of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Rules 2016, and several policies relating to maternity health services of women with disabilities. Still, women with disabilities are suffering from social and environmental barriers relating to healthcare during pregnancy, childbearing, contraception, and abortion. So the research problem is that are those legal arrangements effectively realizing maternal healthcare services, healthcare rights in Bangladesh? So here I have used two model of disability, the human rights model of disability and the social construct model of disability. And it is a qualitative research where I will be using the real life stories from the media reports and the documents analysis, that the legal documents from national, international, and non-governmental reports relating to disability and the maternity healthcare rights of disabled women, and the relevant case laws and precedents. The limitation of the study is that it is only on the women with physical disability. That means the women who are using wheelchair. And the characteristic of the women is that they must have the experience of pregnancy or any other maternity experience in their lifetime. So why Canada? I have chosen Canada as to have the comparative approach with Bangladesh because in Canada, the supreme law is the constitution, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, 1982, which addresses the right of equality and non-discrimination, where every individual must be treated equal before and under law. Moreover, they must get equal protection of law without any discrimination. The Canada Health Act 1984 is therefore supplemented by the equality rights instruments such as the Charter and by statutory human rights legislation, which are there to protect the rights of people with disabilities. Furthermore, in Canada, accessibility legislation aims to remove barriers in a variety of social areas such as goods and services. For instance, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2005 is a law that sets out a process for developing and enforcing accessibility standards for people with disabilities. So at a glance that I have found from a literature review, there are 7 major barriers that for the women to access their maternal health care rights. Number 1, there are two sides of them. One is the demand side and other is from the supply side. From the demand side, there are four barriers like lack of information, additional cost of healthcare, limited mobility, and stigmatization. And from the supply side, the staff attitude, the communication barriers, and inaccessible facilities are the barriers. So I have taken a real life story from a woman of Bangladesh, and she has two children. So she gave me all the information that how she went through in time of her pregnancy and how she was treated by her family and how was the overall experience. Her first child is of 10 years and her second child is of 1 month. She and her husband work in a disability-oriented NGO called Center for Rehabilitation of Paralyzed, CRP, in Savar. After marriage, she had encountered discrimination and negative attitude from her in-laws. They assumed that she could never be a mother. Some said that she might give birth to another child with disability. But her husband and her parents always encouraged her to have a baby. She and her husband decided to do a pre-checkup before taking a baby. Doctor told that she is physically healthy and capable to give birth. The major problem she faced during her pregnancy is the mobility problem. She had a rough time while she was going in the medical center in Savar. Her husband used to take her to the hospital by pushing her wheelchair all the way. It took almost 1 hour to reach to the hospital. Moreover, she found it hard to go to the doctor's chamber because there were stairs, and her husband, with help of another person, needed to hold her that time. So without any help, she could not reach to the hospital and the doctor's chamber. Moreover, she uses manual wheelchair because buying an electric or power wheelchair may cost up to 80,000 taka, which seems impossible for her to buy. She mentioned that she went to the center directed by a female gynecologist, and even in the hospital, there was no accessible toilet for her. The doors and furniture were not comfortable, and she needed help to reach to the examination bed because it was higher than her height. She was happy with the treatment and behavior of the doctor, but some staffs misbehaved with her while asking her to remain in the line of the counter. She mentioned that she was never identified by the Minister of Social Welfare and never applied for registration. So she does not have any service card or insurance policy from the government. Moreover, she faced difficulty paying the medical bill as the clinic was a private institution. For better treatment, she avoided public hospital and went there. So from the story, I have found some barriers that I have identified. The first barrier is that the negative stereotypes and social stigma that can be called as the attitudinal barrier. And then the inaccessible roads, hospital, and transport system, that is the mobility barrier. There was also the inaccessible structure of public building, the physical access barrier. No identification as a person with disabilities, no insurance policy and service card for disability, and the financial barrier is the poverty. So now if I try to understand that how these barriers can be addressed through the international law lens or from the international convention, then I find that there are certain articles like Article 2, 6, 9, 10, 14, 15, 16, 23, and 25, which relate to the healthcare rights of women with disabilities. And in Article 6, it is mentioned that the right to full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by disabled woman and child, and the states shall take appropriate measures to ensure the full in development, advancement, and empowerment of women. So the relevant legislations that I find in Bangladesh, there are legislations like the Article 15D of the Constitution of People's Republic of Bangladesh, the act that I have been mentioned earlier, and the rules of 2016. Moreover, the National Building Construction Act 1952, the National Building Code Rule 2008, and the Road Transport Act 2018 that are relevant with the topic. Today, I'm going to just talk about the physical barrier that she faced during her pregnancy, and I have mentioned about the laws of Bangladesh relating to the physical barrier. So, On the other hand, to compare, I have chosen three legislation from Canada: the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2005, Ontario Building Code Act 1992, and Canada Health Act 1985. From the legislation and from the international convention also, I have found that the concept of universal design is there, which should be accessible, should be accessed by the people with disabilities of the state who has signed the convention. And Bangladesh has signed the convention in 2007. So Bangladesh is under the international obligation to ensure the rights of women with disabilities relating to the accessibility issue. So Article 2 of the convention, it talks about the universal design of accessibility, which includes the design of products, environments, programs, and services to be usable by the people with disabilities where needed. But in reality, what we find that in Bangladesh, only Dhaka, the capital city, 90% public buildings in Dhaka are not designed that way. Even some ministry buildings, there are no ramps or lifts found, which is very frustrating. Moreover, in the Dhaka City Building Construction Rule that is adapted from the Building Construction Act, the concept of universal design is there in the act, but in time of the implementation of the road design or implementation of the establishment design, the designs are not being well maintained or well planned by the engineers and by the building the establishment companies or the companies who make those establishments. Moreover, in the Dhaka City Building Construction Rule has specified an accessibility standards for physically challenged people to all urban services and facilities. So it is found that in law, the provision is there about the universal design, but in reality, the laws are not being maintained or implemented by the authority. So now about the accessibility in the public transport, that I find that in the Act of 2013, there is a provision that 5% seat of the public transport, the women, the people with disabilities, they must get those seats. But it is evident from the from certain research that in Bangladesh, there is no way that a people with disability can get a seat in a public bus because there are no ticket counters for local buses, and drivers only slow down for loading and unloading passengers. So points to intervene. Only just to remove the barriers for the physical barriers, like in case of the roads and establishment, that I find that the first thing is to be done is to identify the people with disabilities. So it is found in our section 31 of the Bangladeshi Act that there the person who is disabled, he or she must go to the Minister of Social Welfare for the registration. But I think in my writing, I will be trying to portray, or I'll be trying to convert the liability not to the person with disabilities but to the state, because it is the responsibility of the state to register them or to identify them. So from the act, I would like to recommend some amendments, like this provision should be changed because the liability should be on the state, not on the people with disabilities. So another point is that there must be some kind of definitions. Like in our act, I didn't find any kind of definition like accessibility standard or the term barrier, but I have found these terms in the AOD Act, the Ontarians, in that act. I have found the certain terms are there. So if the terms are not clarified in the act, it would be hard for the lawmakers even to the implementers to implement the law. And so another thing is that in the Bangladeshi Act, I would like to focus on the modification of the public buildings, roads, through the installation of wooden ramp or lift for the disabled people. Moreover, in our act, the latest Act of Road Transport Act in 2018, I found that there are certain new provisions are coming, that how the people with disabilities, they must get the transport facilities and accessible buses or trains. They can get how they can get those privileges through their interventions. So yeah, yeah. So the concluding mark is that the legal reforms should be done on the importance of simultaneously removing various barriers to inclusion, such as the negative misperceptions of disability, lack of physical accessibility, difficulties in communicating their healthcare rights to the caregivers. So there are some references. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kohinur. That was really very interesting. Our next speaker is Mary Chadee. I hope that I said that. The CH was silent. I was looking at University of West Indies, so from the University of West Indies. And Mary is going to be speaking about the article entitled Beliefs Towards Delinquency, Influence of Attachment and Personality. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, thank you very much, and good night, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to be here today. So this is one area also from my PhD dissertation, which is looking at delinquency. Belief towards delinquency, the influence of attachment and personality. So the purpose of this research was really to investigate relational and individual factors, in this case, personality, in explaining male adolescents' belief towards delinquency. To examine specific objectives, in this case, parental attachment, peer attachment, and personality types on adolescents' belief towards delinquency. From a developmental perspective, it is significance of this study is really, in this regard, is the type of intervention strategies and programmatic intervention materials that could be institutionalized within the school system, as well as the relationship between parents and adolescents, which is really significant in undertaking and building programs designed around these relationships. The theoretical framework. In this case, I utilize social control theory, and in social control theory, as put forward by Hershey and Gottfredson, the bonds of attachment is important to understanding one's normative beliefs as well as behavioral outcomes. So why do individuals conform to normative behavior and adhere to societal laws? Bonds of attachment, which is formed at a very early age with significant others, in this case with parents, acts as a form of social control on adolescents' behavior. It also sets the or work as a working model or a point of reference for adolescents' future engagement with others, and in this case, their relationship with peers. So normative beliefs within this study held by adolescents is really those acceptable or unacceptable behaviors, non-normative and normative behavior as it is related to delinquency. In the case of, and I'll just move on to personality, the other factor that was looked at is really personality. And as we know, personality can be looked at as a distinct quality or character that is unique to adolescents. And adolescents have varying personality types, and these personalities are very stable, enduring characteristics that could be influential in explaining emotions, motivation, in this case, one's attitude or belief towards or propensity towards delinquency. So first, it is something that lies internally within the individual. Secondly, it could have a cognitive, affective, or a behavioral component attached to personality. So certain personality types may make adolescents, in this case, more susceptible or vulnerable to the development or the formation of a particular belief or attitude. And that is in the context of their relational factor or attachment to parents or peers, in this case. For this study, the Big Five personality was utilized and a conceptual model was developed. In the case of the conceptual model, attachment was measured by the dimensions of alienation, communication, and trust, with personality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness. And to look at the relationship between these two, attachment and personality, and how its relationship towards belief towards delinquency. A number of hypotheses were developed, and the first one was really parental attachment. It looked at really what was the indirect relationship between parental attachment and belief towards delinquency. In this case, I looked at mothers and fathers' attachment separately from each other. The second hypothesis, that there was a relationship between peers' attachment and belief towards delinquency. And in the third hypothesis, personality types, and the 5 personality types were looked at, the 5 dimensions between personality types and beliefs towards delinquency. The methodology. So a study design, in this case, was a quantitative design that was used. And this design looked at male adolescents between the ages of 13 to 16 years old from a secondary school, and these were government secondary schools within the Trinidad and Tobago, within a specific geographical area, and that is the Northwestern Corridor. The total number of interviews that was conducted was 425, of which really 408 interviews were utilized for this study. In each school, 4 forms were randomly selected, and the mean age of each of the participants were 15 years of age. The ethnic composition of these participants were 59% African Trinidadian, 14% Indo-Trinidadian, 25% mixed, and 2% other. With regards to the collection of the assessment of really looking at the sample size, the software G-Power31 was utilized to determine the required sample size for this study. A pilot study was also undertaken with a comparable school as to the other 5 schools. A random sample of really 64 persons was chosen, and eventually feedback from that interview was looked at, determined, and adjustments was made to the questionnaire. The instruments used to collect data for this particular study was the Big 5 personality by Goldberg and John and Stristavaster, the attachment scale by Amsterdam and Greenberg, and the belief scale by Whitley and Tanner, 2002. And that scale looked at 20 items, whether certain behavior was acceptable or unacceptable as it relates to delinquency. All data collection and all ethical approval was obtained before this study was undertaken. For data analysis purposes, and linear regression was used. All data screening and assumption for linear regression was fulfilled before the analysis was undertaken. Descriptive and correlations was also undertaken. And of course, outliers and multivariate outliers were detected and dealt with accordingly. So with regards to the results, in the case of the phase hypothesis, the indirect relationship, there was really very weak relationship between mothers and fathers' attachment in explaining, in this case, the propensity or the attitudes or belief towards delinquency. With very small R squared, 4% in the case of mother, with alienation just being a p-value of 0.001. And in the case of father's attachment, similarly, only a 3% with an alienation at a p-level of 0.001. In the case of peers attachment, the relationship between peer attachment, and again, the components of trust, communication, and alienation was a 3-dimension. Similarly, only a small or weak results was indicated, was found with being 4% of the R squared. And again, with alienation having a p-value of 0.009 in this case. With regards to the third hypothesis, in the relationship between personality and adolescence, belief towards delinquency, overall, there was a R squared of 13% with agreeableness, extroversion, neuroticism, and conscientiousness having a p-value of lower than 0.05 or 0.05 in this case. Similarly, what I would have done after the analysis, which was really multivariate analysis, I did a hierarchical regression analysis. I proceeded to undertake this hierarchical regression guided by really the theorization and irrationalization of the literature. As was informed by the theoretical position within the study, is that really the ordering of the steps taken in this hierarchical regression was based upon at a starting point of really personality. So adolescent personality at the face level, which is really a distinct trait by those individuals. And these traits tend to extend outwards towards their relational factors. Their relational factors such as their social relationships with parents being the primary giver, hence step 2 looked at, in this case, attachment as it relates to mother and father, and then followed by peers relationship, which is really peers attachment, which looked at peer alienation, trust, and communication. As we can see from the hierarchical regression analysis, the only main explanatory factors in this case was agreeableness, conscientiousness in the first step, as well as neuroticism. But as we move to the second step, neuroticism became insignificant with alienation or mother's alienation being significant. And that was kept right through with agreeableness, conscientiousness, and alienation by mother being significant at the P001 level or 0.05 level. And it only accounted for 14% in explaining adolescents' belief towards delinquency. So with regards to this, in our discussion, are the findings, moreover, the findings could be looked at in relationship to other studies within the Caribbean context that would have looked at attachment and found very little relationship. So in this regard, the study was similar to those other studies within the Caribbean context that found no relationship between attachment, whether it be mother or father attachment, and beliefs towards delinquency. Similarly, findings also in this study was contrary to numerous research that would have found just quite the opposite. In this case, mother alienation may have contributed to delinquent beliefs in a number of ways. To a large extent, the percentage of the sample came from single-parent household, where there was a matrifocal nature within these family settings, which is important for understanding the form of social control, including the movement towards delinquency. So alienation from this standpoint may have had a breakdown with the informal social control of the family and thereby creating a vulnerability. In line with this, there may be also the lack of adherence to normative beliefs held by parents within the social process setting, leading to adolescents adopting a belief towards delinquency. In the case of conscientiousness, and most studies would have frequently found that really conscientiousness was associated with really positive behavior. However, there has also been studies that would have found a direct relationship between conscientiousness and beliefs towards delinquency. However, it could be argued that delinquent thoughts are different from delinquent behavior. And as our research would have shown, which is really not presented here today, conscientiousness, while it was in some way showed a relationship with adolescents' propensity or attitude towards delinquency, when it was looked at in the larger context of actual behavior, there was no relationship between conscientiousness and delinquent behavior in that regard. So adolescence period also could be taken into consideration when it comes to conscientiousness, where there is a movement towards self-identification and a greater propensity for an autonomy. And in this regard, there could be the emergence between a thought process or inconsistencies between what one thinks and really the value systems and behavior, which may lead to actual behavior or non-actual behavior. In the case of agreeableness, which is another dimension of personality characteristics associated with which was more likely for individuals to hold belief against delinquency, is in this study, agreeableness showed an inverse relationship. So those who were high in agreeableness were less likely to hold attitudes towards delinquency. So there was an adherence to a particular thinking pattern that allows for cooperation and maybe social harmony that comes with a personality of agreeableness. So what does this all say at the end of the day? So with regards to this study, in the case of attachment and personality types, which was really just 2 dimensions that was taken from a larger sample, personality is an importance and remains a significant factor that has to be considered when one looks at adolescents and their propensity or attitude towards a particular behavior. In the context also for delinquent beliefs, which is said to be highly associated towards belief towards delinquency, attachment, and personality is an important precursor in understanding actual delinquent behavior. More so, the parental relationship with youths, those an understanding of really how those factors of attachment may be better able to direct youths and control youths, more so in understanding their personality type in the context of their relationship with parents and peer, to bring about those positive attitudes and beliefs that was required towards a more normative behavior within society. I know I may not have taken my whole 15 minutes. I tend to talk pretty fast, but I thank you very much. So that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Mary. And you took your 15 minutes.
Okay, sure.
So much to think about. Thank you so much. So we are now going to hear from our final 2 panelists from Bishop's University, Vicki Chartrand and Sheyann Foshay. And they are going to present their paper titled Centering Indigenous Women in Mobilizing Justice Beyond Colonial Structures. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the unceded and traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on which I am presenting from today. Further, I would just like to bring attention to the fact that today is National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People Awareness Day, as mentioned prior. Therefore, this presentation also just provides some time to reflect and remember. So as Jane said, my name is Sheyann Foshay, co-author of the paper Centering Indigenous Women in the Mobilizing of Justice Beyond Colonial Structures. Our thesis is to demonstrate the central role of Indigenous women in dismantling colonial structures through their leadership in grassroots mobilizations for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Multiple authors are incorporated and analyzed within the text. However, Vivian Salahana's Black Feminist Ontology, Rememory the Ghosts of Abolition, and Bell Hook's Choosing the Margin as a Space of Radical Openness provide the main theoretical framework. Salahana is used to illustrate the central positionality of Indigenous women in colonial structures, while Hooks elaborates on how this positionality enables a unique perspective that is vital to the dismantling of said structures. So I will be discussing the historical and current context, and then Vicki will discuss examples of Indigenous grassroots initiatives in which Indigenous women are central. So in order to fully grasp this unique perspective of Indigenous women-led initiatives, colonization's historical processes, policies, and impacts are examined and directly connected to the experiences of Indigenous women through looking at the current situation of Vancouver's downtown East Side. The Indian Act's patriarchal reorganization of communities and its displacement of Indigenous women from community and political and leadership roles led to Indigenous women being defined through their relation to men. The result of this being lost band membership, loss of living space and community, Judy rights being stripped away, and many women migrating to urban centers. Targeted legislation, policies, and practices utilized Indigenous women's dispossession as a tool to enforce colonial patriarchal values. Salahana's theory helps connect this historical trajectory of colonial structure seen on a day-to-day level. Her discussion on the colonizing nature of the construction of the Black woman's identity helps us understand Indigenous women's unique existence within colonial structures. The American dream she discusses is like a pie, reflecting carceral violence as a structure, and at the center is the Black woman. Each serving of this dream requires a cut through the center, through the Black woman and her identity. Therefore, she is essential to the structure of the dream while also being able to see the realities of the dream from an unparalleled perspective. As Salahana states, Black feminist ontology is an anti-colonial analysis that captures the expanding and repetitive nature of structural violence, a process whereby we begin to locate a language to speak about the actual, not just symbolic or theorized violence that is racial colonialism. Hooks further notes how this ability to see inside out and outside in enables a focus on both the center and the margin, a sense of wholeness and mode of seeing unknown to oppressors. Within this paper, this American dream is likened to Canada, with the pie reflecting colonial violence. Indigenous women are at the center, their identities constructed through continuous violent cutting and serving of the colonial patriarchal ideal. As Diane Millian discusses in her work Felt Theory, Indigenous women's centrality in family, community, and culture was directly targeted through policy to ensure the instillment of patriarchal values. It is this targeting, violence, and attempted colonial redefinition that has enabled this central perspective, and it is this perspective that informs lived experiences. The downtown east side of Vancouver showcases these lived experiences of colonial violence, the realities of both historical and continuing perpetuations of colonization. Hartman's spectacle, the experience of both terror and pleasure when witnessing racialized suffering, is key to understanding the downtown east side. It is represented as a scene of spectacle, a space of decontextualized, enticing danger and suffering that is to be watched and not acknowledged. The suffering of racialized people is not recognizable unless placed in the context of a white body. Without this connection to a white body and the subsequent dismissal of the suffering racialized person, suffering is not understood as suffering. Pain is not viewed as pain, rather as spectacle, an event to watch or view for brief entertainment without any attachment. This process is discussed specific to Indigenous women, where it entails a continuation of the original dispossessions and colonial attacks against Indigenous women historically, cementing a colonizer's identity as dominant. This staging of spectacle is evident in the context of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, with many media outlets and people drawn to extreme examples and stories of violent encounters or deaths, without understanding the reality of this suffering. Indigenous women represented in the media are visible through their alcohol consumption, drug use, or the violence they encounter. Everyday realities of colonization and poverty, such as drug use, sex work, mental health issues, and violence, are made hyper-visible through media overexposure and the inability to recognize Indigenous suffering. These media representations remove historic colonial context and reproduce colonial values. They make this hypervisibility worse through stigmatizing spectacular tropes that reinforce colonial definitions of Indigenous women and further repress the memory of colonial violences past and present. The effects of colonization are no longer recognized through such spectacles and erasures. Further, representations perpetuate colonial narratives of vulnerability, of Indigenous women in need of protection, and of the inevitable nature of Indigenous women's death in urban spaces. This inevitability also erases the possibility of Indigenous presence within urban spaces, claiming it as a white colonial space intolerant of Indigenous people. Inevitable death or harm in urban spaces reinforces colonial structures by forcing Indigenous women to uphold colonial values under threat of death. An Indigenous woman is being defined by media representations, by government policies, by other non-Indigenous people, rather than being heard. Indigenous resistances and voices are actively silenced. It is here that this central perspective is not only capable of informing lived experiences, but resistances as well. As argued in this paper, this can be directly seen in Indigenous women-led grassroots initiatives, where the silencing of resistances is overcome and colonial structures can be dismantled from within. So with that, I'm now going to hand it over to Vicki to continue. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Cheyann. That was great. I too think it's really prescient that we're presenting on National Awareness Day for the murdered and disappeared. Before I start, I do want to thank the organizers for all your invisible labor. I think that's really important that I acknowledge that. And just all the presenters too for your insights and your energy. I appreciate that as well. And just to note, it's a little bit dark out, but you can't see it, but I am actually on the beautiful unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Abenaki people. So just to give some context, this work that Cheyann and I are building on is part of a project that takes part of talking to the families of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And in fact, not too long ago, a few years back, we had a panel of the families and the women at this very conference. And so part of this was a cross-country road trip. It was actually, we were camping and driving and talking to the families and communities. That was pre-COVID age, and then post-COVID, we've actually started doing quite a few Zoom interviews with some of the families. Other things we did was a national media scan, and this is where we actually collected over 500 grassroots initiatives of the towards the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I'm just going to post in the chat the link to those, the resource directory or the resources of these 500 plus initiatives, because the magnitude and critical mass of work that in support of Indigenous women is unprecedented. And then finally, the other part of this work is actually just a reading of the national inquiry, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry, the transcripts, which is 118 transcripts, thousands of pages. So, there's quite a bit of work that's being done around this, and I think it doesn't get quite as much visibility as it should, as I think Cheyann talked about. Either it's these kinds of erasures or spectacles that we're seeing around this. And so as Cheyann highlights, the same violences and extractions targeted at the land are also extended to women's bodies. So violence then, in particular sexual violence, it's not about those usual tropes that we hear about power and control as commonly projected, but it's the act of violent extraction, ownership, and death worlds. So here, except here, unlike Homo sacer, whereby life is bare or accorded no value and cannot therefore be sacrificed, hers is a life that is sacrificed. It stands between the bounty of settler conquest. It's a life that must be sacrificed, not only as an obstacle to material resources, but to annihilate, to obliviate everything that she represents. So it's creation, life force, earthly mystery. So as shared in the testimony of the National Inquiry, they didn't kill the Indian in us. We are still here. My mother lives on in me. And when I look at my brother, she lives on in him. And I look at my nephew and I look at their eyes and she lives on in them. Indigenous women are not peripheral to colonial orderings. They're central to its organizing forces of imperial rule, patriarchal subordinations, white supremacy, heteronormative ideals, all these many other normative hierarchies. As Viviana Helen shows us, and that Sheyann had talked about, what Foucault could never see was at the center, in the middle of that pie, resides not the all-seeing eye of the state alone, but simultaneously beneath its uniformed boots and transcended above it are the enslaved Black women and her children carrying the violence upon their backs. This understanding of the centrality of women of color and Indigenous women is reflected in a quote from Carol Martin from the Downtown East Side in her cross-examination at the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, where she says, women are bombarded, Indigenous women are bombarded by laws, policies, and procedures that work against them at every level, where the only recourse is to refuse. And that's exactly what Carol Martin did when they were trying to take away her grandbabies. And she just refused. She blocked the way and so that they could not take the grandbabies away. And that's the only recourse that she had and that many Indigenous women have. So in her work From Margin to Center, Bell Hooks reminds us that these spaces are more than places of deprivation. The margins rather, or as Vivian Salahana makes clear, the center, exists as sites of radical possibility, a place from which to imagine and create new life worlds. Indigenous women are at the center of knowing and seeing. And this was reflected in a quote from Chickadee Richard, who was actually one of the panelists from the couple of years ago that I was talking about here in Winnipeg, where she said at this very conference, from the grassroots level looking up, we see the systems. We see what they do not see. We see the problem, we see the wrongs. We can take care of our communities. And I think this seeing and knowing is evident in the magnitude of organizing and mobilizing that collected in this the Unearthing Justice resource collection, as represented by all the Indigenous community and organizing, particularly led by Indigenous women. And it doesn't only highlight the vastness of Indigenous resource and strength, but a critical mass of mobilizing beyond colonial structures, reflected in constellations of support, safety, caregiving, healing, connecting, and remembering, among many others. So what these activities do beyond just supporting missing and murdered Indigenous women is they actually show us pathways to justice and what community building looks like, or what justice can look like through a lens of community building. At their own expense, at their own time, with little support, and not to mention 500 years plus of colonization and ongoing colonization. So just to give a couple examples, and then I'll shift over to you folks, to you good folks, to get some questions. But so there's things like the Faceless Jaw projects that was started by Gloria LaRocque, who gives a visual representation to showcase how each statistic tells a story. There's in Winnipeg, where many folks are now, the Mama Bear Clan Patrol. I know you've heard of the Bear Clan Patrol, which was actually started in the Winnipeg in the 1980s by a group of women and the youth movement, who were doing vigils in the downtown or in the north end of the city. There's also the Mama Bear Clan, who of North Point Douglas in Manitoba, when they pick up used needles, hand out blankets and food to the homeless, and they perform patrols near the Red River. And sometimes they just simply give people hugs, right? And so Indigenous grassroots come from communities and families themselves working to bring communities together. We also have things like feasts to honor our missing and murdered. And the feast began in 2016 in Toronto as a healing ceremony that advocates the inclusion of men to be part of the solution, whereby men also share in their experiences and understandings. There's not to mention the marches, the memorials, and the vigils across the land known as Canada for disappeared and murdered Indigenous women. And this again is unprecedented. The marches are strong expressions of resurgence that affirm Indigenous women's presence in relation to the land and to one another in all their relations. So it's reconnecting women and people back to each other. And there are many other radical acts of possibility, such as artwork, ceremonies, concerts, dances, documentaries, drumming, fasts, feasts, gatherings, murals, multimedia, music, videos, performances, rallies, storytelling, vigils, walks, and among many other things. These are all symbolic and shared acts that center the women and thus reconnect people to land, people and land. Muisha Gomen points out that speaking and telling, praying and witnessing assures the power of story to decolonize spatial discourses by remembering the connections people have to each other and the life-giving force at work. And it's through these Indigenous women whereby the work that is done at the level of the land, that connections, belonging, remembering, and occur to mobilize justice well beyond these colonial structures. So thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Vicki and Sheyann. So much to, and all of the panelists, so much to think about and so much to discuss. I do recognize we're a few moments over, but this is our last panel for this evening, so I think we can work with that. So I am going to open it up for questions from all of you. I am going to start with a question from Brianna, and this is for Khandakar. She is asking, could a link between the alienation of mothers and opinions on delinquency lead to judgment against single mothers, working mothers, or other already vulnerable groups?
Ma'am, is this question is for me?
It is.
No, I think that question's for Mary.
Sure. So I did the on attitudes towards delinquency, so
My apologies.
that's all right.
It's for Mary, yes.
Sure.
Yeah,
So it's a very good question with regards to alienation. Alienation is measured, I think, within this study, the extent to how isolated adolescents feel with those close relationships. One of the things that we're exploring is to see if single parents in this case made any difference. I know there are mixed results, and I want to say no, because what we're trying to avoid is really that stigmatization and that to prevent any type of stigmatization by saying that really single parent household creates delinquency, when it may be other factors that are also involved, or other components of these relationships that speaks to that. I don't know if I may have answered your question in that regard. You're welcome.
Sorry, I was muted. I have a question for Kohinur. I was curious about your sample. You were talking about physical disability for women being measured in terms of or defined as women that were in wheelchairs. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more, because as we know, there's a number of physical disabilities that wouldn't necessarily manifest themselves in terms of utilizing a wheelchair. And I'm wondering why, or if those other physical disabilities in women were excluded in your research.
Yes, ma'am. The thing is that the term, the physical disability term, has been defined in the Act of Bangladesh that I have been discussing, the 2013 Act. And in that Act, I have found the portion of the women who are using wheelchair, or the people who are using wheelchair. So there is a portion mentioned that the people who are using wheelchair, that can be that injury can be done by from their birth, any kind of accident or any spinal cord injury, some kind of injuries can be there. So I am in my study, actually I have tried to find out those women who are using wheelchairs. Maybe it is for their any kind of defect from their birth, like people in Bangladesh, it is called the polio. Polio is very much we find this disease in the rural area of Bangladesh. So from a very early childhood, the women or the children who got those kind of diseases, they became disabled later in their life or from the very early childhood. So I am targeting only those women because in this pandemic, actually, I couldn't get many people to interview or to get information from them. So I have just tried to find out one or two stories, real life stories, who can give me an insight about the problems. Because in Bangladesh, actually, ma'am, there are similar problems. There are major problems which are people with disabilities are suffering likewise. They are because the roads are not accessible. So everyone, even a able person, even he or she can have difficulties while accessing the road because the system is not working that well. So in my writing, I would like to incorporate only a smaller zone because I didn't have that much access to work in a wider scale.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have another question for Vicki and Sheyann. How do you think we can bring this knowledge and perspective to youth on reserve and off reserve?
Want to give that a go, Sheyann?
Sure, I'll go. My first thought was just that the information sort of already in the communities. It's coming from the communities. You know, youth are pretty much involved in a lot of these initiatives, or they are leading the initiatives sometimes. So I really don't distinguish between off reserve, on reserve for these initiatives too. So yeah, I don't know if Vicki has anything to add to that, but.
Oh, I think that was really well said. A lot of this work is actually being generated by the youth, and I'll just to echo what Sheyann was saying, just to give a story. So when we would, Gladys and I were going from city to city and town to town, talking to the families, we'd go through the settler cities and towns, and people would just look at us. She was driving a war pony, and in the war pony, she would paste on her vehicle all the images of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And most in the settler communities, for the most part, people would look on in sort of in a somewhat voyeuristic way, or as Sheyann described, a spectacle, but without not much approaching us and whatnot. When we get into on reserves or Indigenous communities, the people would come to the car. Gladys would get out, and Gladys gets on wetsuits, and she's a grassroots activist for the missing and murdered, and they would shake her hand. and they would talk about their own stories, and they would actually point to pictures on her car, and they would actually know people who, the people on her car as well. And in addition to that, then they would offer us food for our travels, lodging, gas, and other amenities, right? So it just shows the outpouring of how much community really is central to this and attuned to this and what's really going on. I think it's more white folks like myself that need to be made a little bit more aware of it. Yeah.
I have one last question, if I may, to Sheyann and Vicki as well. And I'm going to speak, and hopefully you can make some sense of what the question is, because I haven't formalized it in my mind. But there certainly have been critiques about the national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women, in that it may be another form of colonialism and hierarchies of power. If the inquiry, all of the efforts and the energy on the inquiry, and then of course we wonder about implementation and change, and how the grassroots advocacy and organizations can interface with that entity, these inquiries that are done. And certainly looking back on the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry that was done decades ago in Manitoba, and a lack of implementation and action resulting from that inquiry. So as I say, I'm not sure how I formulate that question, but if you could speak to the critiques.
Yeah, the families, a lot of the families, not all, and I know that it's contentious within communities as well, whether there should have been an inquiry or not, and whether those resources should have went towards yet another inquiry that's going to sit on the shelves. But one of the folks that I spoke to, his name was Alec, he's passed on now, and he was okay me saying his name, talked about, but all those inquiries also carry the blood of the people who testified in them. Right. And I think that's important that we remember that inquiry wasn't just about the policy and the legislation, but it was for the people who fought for it, for the people who got to share their stories for the first time, maybe, so there's a lot of ancillary outcomes that fall from that inquiry that are well above and beyond just what these sort of policy and bureaucratic and legislative formats entail. And I think Sheyann had mentioned Diane Millian in her work, but Diane Millian's work is actually really central to this, because in all these truth commissions and these human rights legislations and whatnot, at the center of it all, and this is kind of the framework in which we're operating from, is that it provides the very framework for which Indigenous women can talk about their experiences and express exactly how they are fundamental. Those experiences are fundamental to understanding and moving beyond these kinds and types of violences. So while the inquiry and the intentions that it may have fallen short of everything that anyone's have ever expected, on one hand, it also provides, when you're fundamentally denied any kind of justice, it provides that kind of recognition on one hand, not necessarily ideal, but on the other hand, it moves beyond just a bureaucratic framework whereby, the families organized, they came together, they cultivated each other. So there was so much going on beyond, above and beyond what many of us think the inquiry was really just about. That's my response. But again, and I don't want to, I think for every, I don't want to put on this Indigenous lens where I'm just speaking for folks because I'm not a family member by any stretch either. But that was my sense from some of the folks I spoke to and what I got from it. I don't know if Sheyann, you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, I think I'll quickly just add that for me, there's like two layers to it. I think like you said, there's that element of the power of testimony, the power of having it out there. But then to me too, the lack of follow through and implementation highlights the power of going beyond colonial structures, the power of grassroots work, because it's the system that you can see some change. You can really have it from the people for the people. That sounds cliche, but that's how I see it anyway. So it is an element of recognition and having your story out there, but at the same time, it can also be beneficial to go grassroots as well.